Ladies and gentlemen, for over 30 years, I've been associated with the Federalist Society. I first became aware of Ted Cruz when he was in law school at Harvard in the early 90s. The Federalist Society's executive director, Gene Meyer, told me that this was a young man with great talent and that we should watch him. Indeed, referring to Cruz's time as a student at Harvard Law School, the well-known liberal law professor, Alan Dershowitz, said, Cruz was off the charts brilliant. During high school, and I want to tell you why. During high school, Senator Cruz participated in a Houston-based group called the Free Market Education Foundation, where he learned about free market economic philosophers such as Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, Frederic Bastiat, and Ludwig von Mises. Cruz graduated cum laude from Princeton University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in public policy from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. After graduating from Princeton, as you know, he went to Harvard Law School, graduating magna cum laude in 1995. While at Harvard, Senator Cruz was a primary editor of the Harvard Law Review, and executive editor of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Journal of the Federalist Society, and a founding editor of Harvard Latino Law Review. And at Harvard, Senator Cruz was one of the select John M. Olin Fellows in Law and Economics. Now, Senator Cruz, as you know, has a remarkable background and upbringing. But enough talk. It's time for Senator Ted Cruz from the great state of Texas.
Well, thank you very much. What a blessing to join you here in North Carolina. You know, I understand that Secretary Clinton was supposed to be invited. But apparently the foundation couldn't find a foreign nation to foot the bill. We had big news yesterday from Hillary Clinton. She's announced, to the astonishment of nobody, that she is running yet again for president. And they also had big news. Ready for Hillary has their first major hire, the director of email security. So Lois Lerner now has a job. You know, with Secretary Clinton's entry into this race, it is an appropriate time to focus on some of the challenges facing this country. Now, there are a host of challenges. There are domestic challenges. There are economic challenges. There are millions of people across this country hurting because of the failures of the Obama economy, because of the disaster of Obamacare. There is the relentless threat to our constitutional rights from the federal government. But what I'd like to focus on today is I'd like to look beyond our shores. I'd like to focus on the national security and foreign policy threats that are facing this country and that present a manifest danger to the safety and security of every American. It's worth thinking back to the state of the world in 2008 when President Obama and Hillary Clinton rose to leadership. In 2008, Vladimir Putin was testing American resolve in the nation of Georgia. In 2008, Iran had installed some 5,000 centrifuges and was enriching uranium. In 2008, China was beginning a major military buildup. The Cuban-backed dictator of Venezuela was mocking the American president at the United Nations, saying that the stench of sulfur lingered after. The ongoing tensions between Israel and the Palestinians threatened to flare up yet again. An international financial crisis had weakened America's standing in the world. And America was stretched thin after 7 long years of war that had followed the attacks on September 11th, 2001. There were real challenges in 2008. And yet, President Obama came to office promising a new world of peace if he was elected, because he would understand our enemies and persuade them to no longer hate America. We recall tens of thousands of Europeans pouring into the streets to cheer this more sophisticated and urbane leader. The chants, Obama, Obama, Obama. We recall the president in the opening months of his presidency receiving a Nobel Peace Prize for the fact that he was not George W. Bush. Receiving a Nobel Peace Prize, not for anything he'd done, but for the promise of what they hoped he would do. Hopes were high for President Obama, and they were also high for his new Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. And they went right to work. They started by returning the bust of Winston Churchill to the United Kingdom. An auspicious beginning that illustrated the treatment our allies could expect under the Obama-Clinton foreign policy. Secretary Clinton traveled to Beijing and announced that under the Obama administration, human rights issues, presumably including forced abortions and the persecution of Christians, were now, quote, off the table. It's no longer a concern of America. The president himself traveled to Cairo to blame America for the friction between the free world and radical Islamic terrorists who want to destroy us. He began what so many perceived as a global apology tour. And things only got worse from there. The Green Revolution in Iran, an incredible opportunity for change, as people poured to the streets against the radical mullahs, the supreme leader fighting for freedom. And President Obama and Secretary Clinton decided the best course was to do nothing, to ignore the Green Revolution and allow the Iranians to crush it under their boot. Instead, Secretary Clinton launched a Russia reset with a big red button. Misspelled in Russian, as it so happened. In her book, Secretary Clinton says the Russia reset was the greatest foreign policy success of her tenure as Secretary of State. On that, I happen to agree with her. But somehow the people of Ukraine might look at it a little bit differently. We saw November 5th, 2009, a terrorist attack on the homeland, as Nidal Hassan in Fort Hood murdered 14 innocent souls, including an unborn child, and injured over 30 soldiers and civilians. And we saw the Obama administration classify that attack as workplace violence. I'll tell you, on Friday, I was at Fort Hood, where finally, after 5 years, our soldiers who gave their lives, who were wounded in that terrorist attack, were finally awarded the Purple Heart they deserved. I will tell you that was particularly rewarding because the reason they were awarded the Purple Heart is legislation that I introduced in the Senate last year to mandate their being eligible for the Purple Heart. Passed the Senate Armed Services Committee unanimously. We were able to bring together both Democrats and Republicans over the passionate objections of the Obama Pentagon. And it was passed into law in December, which is why, finally, the Purple Hearts were awarded. Now, I have to tell you, as I looked at each of those soldiers, The message I conveyed to each of them was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry this took 5 years. It shouldn't have taken 5 years. Mind you, Nidal Hassan was communicating with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known radical Islamic terrorist, expressly asking about the permissibility of waging jihad against his fellow soldiers. The federal government knew this and did nothing to prevent the terrorist attack that followed from that communication. When Hassan walked through Fort Hood, murdering his fellow soldiers, he yelled out, Allahu Akbar, one after the other, and yet, to this day, this administration refuses to acknowledge that as radical Islamic terrorism. We saw the consequences of leading from behind in Libya. We saw red lines drawn and then dissolve in Syria, which meant every bad actor on earth took note that when this president speaks, he doesn't mean what he says. We saw the unpunished murder of 4 Americans, including our ambassador, Chris Stevens, in Benghazi. And we saw the President and Secretary Clinton both go to the American people and not admit that it was radical Islamic terrorism, just like Fort Hood had been, but instead try to blame it on some silly internet video when they knew full well it was terrorists who had murdered those 4 Americans in Benghazi. We've seen letters and phone calls to the Iranian mullahs while American citizens languish in Iranian prisons. We've seen ISIS dismissed as the junior varsity of radical Sunni terrorists. We've seen Yemen and Somalia hailed as models of successful counterterrorism. Just a few months ago, the president of a national television address, you'll recall he had admitted he had no strategy on ISIS. Again, to the surprise of nobody. And then when he held a national televised address, he said now his strategy on ISIS is simple. He was going to follow the great successes we have had in Yemen and Somalia, which if you were to pick out 2 countries that are in greater chaos from the disaster of counterterrorism policy, it would be difficult to find 2. We've seen the president making nice with Raul Castro and with Maduro. We've seen an Egyptian president, al-Sisi, having the courage to call out radical Islamic terrorism. And yet, an administration willing to stand up and not speak with the same courage that a Muslim leader in Egypt is demonstrating. We've seen the terrorist attack in Paris described by the president as a, quote, random act of violence. There is nothing random when Islamists come in with butcher knives to a kosher deli to murder Jews because of their Jewish faith. It is a naked act of anti-Semitism. We've seen 21 Coptic Christians on their knees, beheaded by ISIS. And the White House putting out a statement saying that they were killed because of their Egyptian citizenship. That was not why they were killed. As Pope Francis powerfully said, their blood confesses Jesus Christ. We saw just over a week ago 147 Christians in Kenya systematically slaughtered. And just to clarify things for this administration, Al-Shabaab, the radical Islamic terrorist there, which came from Somalia and crossed over to Kenya, inquired person by person what their faith was. If they were Muslims, they were spared. If they were Christians, they were shot in the back of the head. 147, and yet I would note, if you go to the White House statement on the atrocity in Kenya, you will search in vain for the words Islam or Christian. We cannot defeat radical Islamic terrorism with a president who is unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. And we have seen President Obama and Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry systematically unravel, undermine, and attack our friendship and alliance with the nation of Israel. We have seen the White House ridicule and assault and attack Prime Minister Netanyahu. We have seen the Obama political machine go to Israel and help lead the political campaign against the elected leader of our ally. We have seen Democrats boycott Prime Minister Netanyahu. Think about that for a second. President Obama recently had time to pal around with Raul Castro. Perhaps he asked Mr. Castro about his policy of imprisoning and torturing dissidents. But yet he could not be bothered to sit down and talk with Prime Minister Netanyahu when he came to America, and instead his vice president boycotted the speech. These episodes aren't isolated events. They're not discrete and separate data points. They are part of a broader problem, part of an inability or unwillingness to recognize the threats to this country. What are the fruits of the Obama-Clinton approach to the world? Well, today Iran has 19,000 active centrifuges, up from 5,000. And the best we've been able to do is negotiate a terrible deal that will pave the way for Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, the single greatest national security threat facing this country. ISIS today controls a territory about the size of Great Britain and is savagely murdering Americans, Israelis, British citizens, Japanese, Jordanians, and Egyptian Coptic Christians. Putin has consolidated his gains in Georgia, has invaded our ally Ukraine while we stood by and did nothing, has annexed Crimea, and is eyeing further expansion into NATO members such as the Baltics. Our staunchest Middle East ally, Israel, faces unprecedented isolation at international institutions and can no longer rely on the unqualified support of the United States of America. China, which is currently playing the role of the wolf farthest from the sled, is on a campaign of territorial expansion, the intent of which is to kick America out of the Pacific. And the American military has been undermined by years of aggressive cuts while money has been poured into economic stimulus programs that didn't work, entitlement programs like Obamacare that have exploded the deficit and undermined our ability to protect this nation. President Obama and Secretary Clinton have had their chance. Their policies do not work. Leading from behind is a dismal failure. We need a new track. We need to get back to the principles that made America strong. We need to restore America's leadership in the world. There is a reason America is the exceptional nation. And I do not mean exceptional in the sense that President Obama describes it. When he was famously asked if he believed in American exceptionalism, he says, sure, just like the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. I would suggest that reflects a profound misunderstanding of the unique role America has played in the world, of the clarion voice for freedom America has been. No other nation has spilled more blood or treasure for freedom. Not to oppress, not to subjugate, but to liberate. I will tell you, when you travel abroad, when you meet with foreign heads of states, with our allies, when you meet with defense ministers, when you meet with foreign affairs ministers, the question is consistent. They ask over and over again. They grab you by the shoulder, they look you in the eyes, and they say, "Where is America? We need America. We can't do this without you." For the next 20 months, I believe we are essentially in a Hobbesian state of nature. It's like Lord of the Flies. The only limit on bad actors is the extent of their own strength. Because for the next 20 months, the bullies and tyrants of the world, I believe, have taken the measure of the man in the Oval Office and determined that he is no credible threat whatsoever. But the good news is, in the annals of history, 20 months is not a very long time. We need new leadership in Washington that doesn't just start with symbolic steps, like welcoming the bust of Winston Churchill back into the Oval Office. But it starts by making clear that America will stand with our friends and will stand up to our enemies. It starts by making clear that America will stand unshakably with the nation of Israel. And that we will use every lever at our disposal to prevent the United Nations and other international bodies from undermining the sovereignty of the nation of Israel. It means making clear to our neighbors, such as the nation of Canada, that we will finally build the Keystone Pipeline. And it means standing up to bad actors, such as making clear to brutal dictators like Castro's in Cuba that billions in economic relief will not flow until real reforms and freedom occurs in that prison island 90 miles from our shore. We can immediately begin providing defensive lethal arms to the people of Ukraine who are desperate to defend their nation from Putin. We can embark on a serious, sustained, robust air campaign with the specific objective of destroying ISIS. And part of that entails standing with our friends and allies, the Kurds, the Peshmerga, the fighting military force. We should be arming the Kurds, not sending weaponry to Baghdad and leaving the Kurds alone. And we need to revisit our failed budgetary priorities so that we rebuild the military and stand with our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And then there's the question of Iran. The single biggest threat we have is Iran. This deal, on the face of it, expires in a decade. So it begins with the proposition that the United States of America is perfectly fine with Iran having a nuclear weapon in 10 years. In my view, what we are doing is we are repeating the mistakes of the 1990s of the Clinton administration with respect to North Korea. In the 1990s, the Clinton administration relaxed sanctions on North Korea. Billions of dollars flowed into that country. And they used that money to develop nuclear weapons. We have literally gone and taken the lead negotiator from North Korea, a woman named Wendy Sherman under the Clinton administration, and recruited her. She is the lead negotiator for the failed deal with Iran. The same person with expertise on screwing this up once, we brought her back to do it again. But in this instance, the threat is qualitatively different. North Korea, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, they're radical, they're unpredictable, they're extreme. But at their core, they're megalomaniacal narcissists. Which means some modicum of rational deterrence is possible. Both father and son understood if they ever used a nuclear weapon, that instant their regime would be over. That day. The problem with Iran is when you are dealing with theocratic zealots who glorify death and suicide, ordinary cost-benefit analysis doesn't work. In recent weeks, in the midst of the negotiation, a senior Iranian general said, the annihilation of Israel is, quote, non-negotiable. Apparently, those terms are acceptable to this White House. That was a couple of weeks ago in the middle of this deal. Not too many weeks before that, Ayatollah Khamenei in 2014 gave an address to the assembled masses in Tehran where he said falsely, America is the greatest human rights violator on the face of the planet. The masses responded by chanting, death to America. And that's actually a holiday they celebrate. In Iran every year, we have Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July. Death to America Day is a real holiday in Iran. It is the anniversary of Iran seizing Americans hostage. When they assemble in masses and chant, death to America. If history teaches anything, it is that when somebody tells you they want to kill you, believe them. So what should we be doing? Well, I filed my own legislation on Iran sanctions that would immediately reimpose sanctions, that would strengthen them and make them more crippling, and that lays out a clear path if Iran wants to lift the sanctions. Number one, they must disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges. Number two, they must hand over all of their enriched uranium. Number three, they must shut down their ICBM program, which exists for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to carry a nuclear weapon to the United States of America. And number four, they must cease being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. That's actually how a strong, sensible foreign policy would approach a theocratic zealot like Ayatollah Khamenei. You know, it was very revealing some weeks ago, the reaction when I joined 46 other senators sending a letter to Iran. The White House promptly went hysterical. To quote the bard, methinks she doth protest too much. Now, I would note what this letter said is it said under the United States Constitution there are two ways and two ways only to make binding federal law. The president can negotiate a treaty that is ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, or Congress can pass legislation through both houses of Congress that's signed into law by the President. Those are the only two ways under our Constitution to make binding law in the United States. The White House was very unhappy about that because I guess they don't recognize those constitutional limits. And Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif responded, said, no, 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 you senators, you do not understand. Under international law, a head of state can bind the nation in perpetuity. Now, you know what? In Iran, that's correct. Iran has a supreme leader. And if you disagree with the supreme leader, you'll be shot. Fortunately, the United States doesn't have a supreme leader. Yet. A couple of weeks later, I went on MSNBC on Morning Joe. They were a bit dismayed about the letter. And so Mika asked me if I had any regrets. I said, yes. My regret was like John Hancock, that I didn't make my signature bigger. So that the Ayatollah could read it without his reading glasses. But here's the consequence that matters. It appears President Obama is going to resist taking this foolhardy deal to Congress. If this deal is not approved by Congress, and I do not believe it will be approved by Congress, then it is not binding law. And that means when the next president arrives in January 2017, the very first order of business should be to repudiate any Iran deal that undermines our national security. An Iran with nuclear weapons that calls Israel the little Satan and America the great Satan is an unacceptable risk to this country. And a strong commander-in-chief would stand up and say to the nation of Iran, either you will halt your nuclear weapon production, or we will halt it for you. Let me say a final word of encouragement. You know, as you go down the litany of where we are in foreign policy, as you go around the globe to region after region after region, every one of which has gotten worse under the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, it can be a depressing list. Midway through, there were a few people sitting here going, geez, I came to a lunch for something peppy and uplifting. This is somber stuff. But here's a word of encouragement. We've seen great challenges before. And every time we've seen great challenges, with God's providential blessing, the American people have risen to the occasion. And I will point to one specific example, which is 1980. In 1980, things were bad. Domestically, we had double-digit unemployment, we had 22% interest rates, we had gas lines around the block. We had our hostages languishing in Iran for 444 days. While the president wrung his hands, unsure of what to do, we sent a military effort in to rescue them. The helicopters crashed in the desert with no opposing fire. And mind you, the President of the United States was telling America, accept malaise. Accept that we cannot keep up with the Soviet Union and put on a sweater. Now, I point to that example because that example has a very happy ending. We remember what happened in 1979 and 1980, which was there was a grassroots movement that came from the people, that came from millions of men and women across this country and became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. If you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run and hide. But that Reagan revolution from the people swept up like a tsunami and turned this country around. It's worth remembering how quickly things changed. Our hostages were released from Iran the day Reagan was sworn in. And within a decade, we won the Cold War without firing a shot, and we tore the Berlin Wall to the ground. American leadership can transform things very, very quickly. And the book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very much like the late 70s. I think the parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. In fact, the one person thrilled about the job Barack Obama is doing is Jimmy Carter. And the word of encouragement I would give you is the same thing is happening. The same thing that happened in 1980 is happening today. Millions of Americans are waking up, are rising up. Men and women, many of whom never been involved in politics, are looking up and saying, what on earth are we doing? We got to get back to the principles that built this country. We got 20 months to go. And the reason I'm optimistic is simple. I'm optimistic because of each and every one of you standing together to reignite the promise of America. And I am honored, I'm humbled to stand with you as together we restore that shining city on a hill that is the United States of America.
Thank you, Senator. It's great to have you here, and it's a great way to kick off our series. Thank you for making the trip on commercial airline, I should say. That was lovely.
And I apologize for my tardiness. I sat on the tarmac for an hour in Houston.
There you go. There you go.
So,
ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. We hope to see you at a future John Locke event.
And Corey, I'll tell you what, if it's acceptable with folks, yes, I'm happy to answer or dodge a few questions.
Okay, yes, that's fine.
Yes, ma'am.
So, I'm so excited that you're running. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In the primaries, I know you said that your very first commandment, if you will, is to not trash other Republicans, which I just love. I'm wondering how that's going to work against Jeb Bush and Karl Rove, because they're just saving up the money to come after you. And I can see it working against Hillary in general. But the primary, I don't want you to play Mr. Nice Guy because we've seen how well that works out.
Well, you know, I can't imagine that anyone would say anything mean about me. You know, I think the best example, to go back to the 1980 example, when Reagan promulgated his 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of another Republican. Now, it's important to note what he meant when he said that. He didn't mean you never disagree with another Republican. I mean, remember, Ronald Reagan in 1976 primaried Gerald Ford, the sitting Republican president. By the way, you want to tick off Republican leadership, come within inches of toppling the sitting Republican president in a Republican primary. But the way he did it throughout the course of it, he didn't impugn Gerald Ford's character. He didn't attack him personally. He just said, we got to stand for something. That the Republican Party, it's not a fraternal order. It is a community of people who share common principles. So my approach to the primary is exactly the same. And I would note, I've had some experience when I ran in Texas. When we launched the campaign for Senate, we started out, I was at 2% in the polls. The margin of error was 3%. I came home to my wife, Heidi. I was all excited. I said, we're at 2%. She said, well, sweetheart, technically, couldn't you be at -1? I said, thank you, my love. And it was a $50 million primary, most expensive primary in the country. We were outspent 3-1. They ran $35 million of nasty personal attacks. $20 million saying I was a red Chinese communist. They actually printed Chinese currency with my face on it discolored to look Chinese. Throughout the course of it, we didn't reciprocate. We never once impugned the character of my opponent. Indeed, I routinely praised his character and integrity. But what is fair game is policy and record. And I am not at all shy about making distinctions with other candidates that policy and record matters. It matters whether you've stood up to Obamacare or gone along with it. It matters whether you've stood up to executive amnesty or gone along with it. It matters whether you've stood up to Common Core or gone along with it. Yes, ma'am. Sure. So the question is what is my stand on reducing the trade deficit and also on TPP? On both of those, I'll start with the second half. I am emphatically in support of free trade. Free trade benefits this country. The more we open markets to our farmers, to our ranchers, to our manufacturers, the more benefit we get. Now, how do we deal with a trade deficit? The answer is by getting back to an environment where jobs and small businesses are prospering here. You know, it's really striking. The administration is talking right now about inversions, corporate inversions, that American companies are fleeing America and incorporating in other countries because the laws here are so hostile to job creation. And what is the administration's answer? Let's make it even more hostile and punish them. How about creating an environment where suddenly other countries are worried about corporate inversions from their end? Because America is such an attractive place to do business, that to create jobs, that everyone is wanting to come here. How can we do that? You know, this is a group that understands cause and effect. Every time in history we have pursued out-of-control spending and taxes and regulation, the result has been stagnation and misery and malaise. But on the flip side, every time we have pursued tax reform and regulatory reform, simplifying the tax code, reducing the burdens, getting the federal regulators off of the back of the necks of small businesses, the result has been incredible economic growth. We saw it in the 1920s, in the 1960s, in the 1980s. That's what we need to do again, is get back to booming growth. And you know, I used the 1980 example. Since World War II, when it comes to economic growth, we have averaged 3.3% growth a year. There are only 2 4-year periods where growth averaged less than 1% a year. 1978 to 1982, coming out of Jimmy Carter, and 2008 to 2012. Now, the good news, just like foreign policy where we talked about how quickly things can turn around, so Reagan comes in 1981, in the middle of a 4-year period of less than 1% growth, of stagnation, of malaise. And what does he do? He pursues tax reform and regulatory reform. By the 4th year of his presidency, 1984, anyone know what the rate of growth was at 84? 7.2%. Booming, small businesses growing. And what that means is it means young people coming out of school with 3, 4, 5 job offers. It means people like my dad, teenage immigrants, washing dishes with nothing, having opportunity to achieve the American dream. That's how we compete, and free trade helps us in that when we have an environment where small businesses are prospering. Yes, sir.
I'm a college student at NC State. And
Yeah.
Many of my friends are paying really high student loan rates. What are you going to do as president to make sure that students aren't bogged down in student debt?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll tell you, young people right now, I'm going to step back for a second and speak generally, and then I'm going to go back to the specifics of your question if I can. But young people right now, let me say to conservatives, I think young people right now present a tremendous opportunity. The last 2 elections, young people voted 70-30 for Barack Obama. And yet, unfortunately, young people are paying the price for that. There are an awful lot of young people with faded hope and change posters sleeping in their parents' basements. And if you were to sit down and try to design an agenda to hammer the living daylights out of young people, it would be difficult to have a more effective agenda than the Obama economic agenda. Let me focus on 3 aspects. Number 1, for 6 years we've had crippling taxes and regulations hammering small businesses. What that means is young people coming out of school can't find jobs. They're struggling. They're hoping to begin their careers. They got student loans, as you noted, up to the eyeballs, and they're wondering if their job is going to be a part-time job as a barista at Starbucks. Economists are referring to this generation of young people, horrifyingly, as a lost generation. Because if you don't get skills in your first job, that's the foundation for your second job, your third job, your fourth job, and the income effects will be with this generation of young people for decades to come. Secondly, Obamacare. One of the simplest ways to understand Obamacare, it is a massive wealth transfer from young, healthy people to everybody else. And if you look at someone's income curve, typically people are poorer when they're younger, and then they accumulate more wealth as they get older. So it's literally taking money from young people with less resources and giving it to old people with more resources. Which is why suddenly young people disapprove Obamacare 70-30. That's flipped upside down because they realized, holy cow, we're paying for this. And number 3, the national debt. When Obama entered the White House, it was $10 trillion. Today, it's over $18 trillion. Who the heck do you think is going to pay for that? All of those come together. You know, the last question, I talked about an environment of booming economic growth. I understand what it's like coming out of school with student loans. When I was in high school, my parents went bankrupt. So when I went to college, I was on my own. They were in the middle of bankruptcy when I went to college. I've been financially on my own since I was 17 years old. So I took about $100,000 in student loans, which I just paid off about 5 years ago. So I fully understand what it's like to be in your 20s coming out of school with a mortgage. The difference for young people is we've got to get to an environment where economic growth is booming, where your school loans that you're taking are to get skills that let you begin a career, that allow you to move towards the American dream. That's really, you know, we put out a meme online. Reaganomics, you start a business in your parents' garage. Obamanomics, you move into your parents' garage. For young people, we need jobs and growth and opportunity, and that's what I think this next election is going to be fought exactly on that terrain. Yes, sir.
To his point,
Yeah.
I've laid off 60 people in this Obamanomics. Many of them state grads. So when we're talking about this, we need to take the shackles off small business, because right now I'm busy. But guess what? I'm a 50-some-year-old guy doing a job I need you to do, but I can't afford to hire you because I don't know what the rules are going to be. So we're getting destroyed. So what are you going to do about taking the shackles off of small business so that we can help these young people get an opportunity to do something for your benefit.
You are exactly right. And as you well understood, if you want jobs and opportunity for young people or for anyone else, the key to it is small businesses. 2/3 of all new jobs come from small businesses. And, you know, one of the things I've done back in Texas is we do lots of small business roundtables. We've done dozens of them all over the state, where I'll bring together 10, 20, 30 small business owners, sit around a table. And we just go around the table and I ask everyone, share issues that are weighing on your heart, that you're thinking about, that you're praying about, that you're concerned about. We have never done a small business roundtable when at least half of the small business owners around the table didn't list Obamacare as the single biggest impediment they're facing in their businesses. Let me describe one we did in Kerrville, a small town in the hill country, central Texas. We were meeting in a restaurant bar. The owners of the restaurant bar were husband and wife, and they said they just had a recent opportunity to expand their business, to double the size of their business. They said from a business perspective, they thought it was a great opportunity. They were excited about it. But they said they'd already decided to pass because they had right now between 35 and 40 employees. If they expanded, they'd be over 50 employees. Over 50 employees would put them under Obamacare. And if they were under Obamacare, they'd be driven out of business. The first 4 or 5 people around that table, every one of them described the exact same scenario. They were between 30 and 40 and 45 employees. They had opportunities to expand, and every one of them had said, we've decided not to do that. Now, I want you to multiply that to millions of small businesses throughout the country that are not creating millions of jobs like the 50 or 60 people you've said you've laid off. It's exactly that. And at the end of the day, look, these small business owners were hurting, but they were able to make ends meet. The people who were really hurting were the young people, were the single moms, were the immigrants, were the people that just wanted to get on that first or second rung. All of the bellhops and waitresses and janitors that would have been hired who don't get hired and get left out. Another fellow around that table in Kerrville had a company manufacturing hunting blinds. He had recently moved his entire manufacturing to China. And he said, listen, I'd rather be manufacturing, this would be 150 to 200 good-paying manufacturing jobs here in Central Texas. I'd rather be doing it here. But if I do it here, I'm under Obamacare, and I can't compete under Obamacare, so I've had to move it to China. And then over on the right on the table was a woman who owned several fast food restaurants. Now, she had enough restaurants that she had well over 50 employees, so she couldn't avoid Obamacare that way, and you can't exactly move your fast food restaurants to China. So what she did instead is she had already forcibly reduced the hours of her employees to 28 or 29 hours a week because the threshold for Obamacare is 30 hours. And she said, her voice started to choke up. She said, you know, a lot of our employees have been with us 5 or 10 years. These are single moms. These are people who are hurting. And they can't feed their kids on 28 or 29 hours a week. But they can't feed their kids if I go to business either. That dynamic is happening all over the place. And leadership, you asked how do we turn it around? We've seen when we've had leadership from the federal government pulling back regulations. One of the reasons Reagan had 7.2% growth is the Reagan administration pulled back regulators and freed small businesses. And I can tell you in this campaign, you know, I'm reminded of when I was in West Texas. I was meeting with a bunch of folks in West Texas, and I asked them, what's the difference between regulators and locusts? I said, well, the thing is, you can't use pesticide on the regulators. And this old farmer leaned back and said, want to bet? All right, let's do one final question. Yes, ma'am.
If we could fast forward to January 2017 and you're ready to repeal Obamacare.
Yes.
How confident are you that the Republicans are going to have a viable option set and ready to go?
That's a great question. Let me take it in a couple of pieces. The question was, January 2017, we win, are repealing Obamacare. How confident am I that the Republicans will have a viable option to replace it? Let me take in a couple of pieces. Right now, the first question of that is how likely is it that Republicans will actually stand up to repeal Obamacare? Here's the simple reality. There are a lot of politicians, a lot of Republicans in Washington who've given up on repealing Obamacare. They campaign on it every 2 years, but they have accepted it as a permanent feature of our economy. So let me answer it in two pieces. Number one, what we should replace it with, but number two, how we get the spinal fortitude to actually do what we're saying. On the question of a replacement, everyone knows we need health care reform. After we repeal Obamacare, we need to reform health care so that we expand competition, we empower patients and consumers, and we disempower government bureaucrats from getting between us and our doctors. And I'll give you 3 specific concrete reforms that embody those principles. Number one, we need to allow people to purchase health insurance across state lines. That's right now illegal. And what it would do is it would allow the creation of a true 50-state national marketplace, which would enable people to purchase low-cost, catastrophic coverage. The biggest barrier to access is cost. You know, if a young person is thinking about buying health insurance, the biggest impediment is, I can't afford it. If you want more access, you want more choices and lower costs. What does Obamacare do? It has fewer choices and higher costs. Number two, we need to expand health savings accounts. So people can save in a tax-advantaged way for more routine health care and prevention. And number three, we need to work to de-link health insurance from employment. A lot of people don't know it's an historical accident that health insurance is tied to employment. Came just out of World War II. There were wage and price controls in places. And employers couldn't raise salaries to attract new employees, so they started offering perks like health insurance, and the tax laws incentivized that. Problem is, we don't live in the 1950s anymore, where someone goes and works for one company 40 years, retires, and gets a gold watch. We live in a mobile, transient economy and society. People move states, they move industries, they move jobs. And if you or I lose our jobs, we don't lose our life insurance, our house insurance, our car insurance. There's no reason you should lose your health insurance. And so one of the things I intend to campaign on in 2016 is making health insurance personal, portable, and affordable. So let's circle back to the other half of your question. How do we actually get that done? If we look to Washington, it's hopeless. I have seen it firsthand. As bad as you think it is, it's worse. But the reason I'm optimistic is just like in 1980. The Reagan Revolution came from the people. How do we actually repeal Obamacare? We make this election a referendum on repealing Obamacare. We come in with a mandate from the people so that for politicians in Washington in both parties, it becomes politically more risky to do the wrong thing than it is to do the right thing. And let me give you a word of encouragement in terms of how this is happening. Now, the fact that y'all came today suggests that perhaps you don't read the New York Times, which is a reflection of wisdom. The New York Times, 3 weeks ago when I announced my campaign for president at Liberty University, the New York Times, and for that matter, the mainstream media went apoplectic. I think several of them actually checked themselves into therapy. And the New York Times explained, Cruz cannot win because the Washington elites despise him. That's the whole basis of my campaign. And so all the mainstream media said, well, the Washington elites control all the special interest, all the lobbying money in Washington, so he can't raise money. So maybe some unwashed ruffians of the grassroots will be with him. But the adults who control the dollars will decide the election. Well, I'll tell you, we launched on March 23rd, so we had a week to go in the fundraising quarter before March 31st. And we set a goal in the campaign that we wanted to raise $1 million in a week. Now, we thought that was a bold and audacious goal, that if we could put $1 million in the bank in a week, it would be a statement, this campaign is going to have the resources to go the distance. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, we failed in that goal. We didn't raise $1 million in a week. We raised $1 million in one day. Within 72 hours, we'd raised $2 million. And by the end of the week, we had raised over $4 million. To put that in perspective, that was over 45,000 contributions. People went to tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org. 45,000 people from all 50 states. 95% of the contributions that came in were $100 or less. Now, to put that in context, $4 million in the opening week is more than any Republican candidate in the opening week has raised in modern times. It's more than Mitt Romney raised in 2012. It's more than John McCain raised, not just in his opening week, in his first 6 weeks, we raised double what he raised in 1 week. So you know what? The New York Times is right. The Washington lobbyists, they ain't with me. They're supporting other candidates in this race. But our strength, what gives me encouragement, is we are standing, just like with the Reagan Revolution, with an army of men and women, of courageous conservatives who are saying, enough is enough. And how do we infuse that backbone? By the way, as an aside, you know, all of us were taught in junior high that invertebrates can't walk upright. And yet politicians disprove that every single day. We infuse the backbone by having the movement come from the people, and that has been what is so encouraging, so uplifting, is the energy, the enthusiasm we're seeing. It's the only way we're going to turn the country around. And so I am grateful to each of you for your leadership, your prayers, and your voices standing up and speaking out in your communities. That's how we turn the country around. It's the only way we've ever done it, and it's the only way we can do it. And I'm encouraged. We've done it before. We're going to do it again. Thank you.